Well, hello, everybody. This is Zeki Hamid. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at KUOW. Welcome to the 11th episode of Are We Going to Be Okay? Now, we took a few weeks off for the summer, but now we're back for some more episodes. And if you haven't joined us before, this series started out as a way to give community members a virtual space to come together and feel like a community again because of the COVID-19 pandemic and our inability to gather in person. At the same time, we wanted to check in with communities and industries that make up our region to see how we're doing and to get tips and tactics on getting through this pandemic together. Now, the title of the series, Are We Going to Be Okay?, has taken a very different meaning over the past couple of months because of the protests against police violence and for racial justice, topics that we'll be discussing today. But before we start, I just want to say that my heart is with Beirut today. The good people of Lebanon have suffered a great tragedy due to the massive explosion a couple of days ago. All my love to my friends and loved ones over there. Stay strong. All right, now I'm going to introduce my co-host for the series, special projects editor and the co-host of Battle Tactics for Your Sexist Workplace, my friend, Jeannie Andel. Hey, Jeannie.
Hi, Zeki. I am really glad that your people are safe in Beirut, as we were just talking about before this started. As you alluded to, this is our activism and organizing episode, and one of the things we'll be talking about is what protests for racial justice look like during the pandemic. But we will also be talking about the role community organizers play in how we all assess and talk about what is happening right now. For close to 2 months, as we all know, Black Americans have been leading protests against police violence around the country. It's probably important to note here that it's been more than 2 months that Black Americans have been leading this fight. But, you know, the news cycle has really been focused on these past couple of months. On each episode of this show, we've tried to provide different tactics and strategies for navigating through this pandemic. We will do some of that today. We're also aiming to leave this hour with strategies for how to think critically about the conversations and news coverage we see of ongoing activism and organizing against systemic racism. And we really want you to be part of the conversation, everyone who's watching. Please send us your comments, your questions on whatever platform you're watching us on. You can go to the comment section right below this screen and drop your questions and comments in there. Send us your questions there, or you can text the word radio to 206-926. 9955. Zeki and I will be checking those throughout the show, which means we probably won't be looking at the screen. It's because we're looking at another screen to check your comments and questions and include them in this conversation.
All right, and now I'd like to introduce our guest. Nikkita Oliver is a Seattle-based creative community organizer, abolitionist, educator, and attorney. She says working these intersections, she strives to create experiences which draw us closer to our humanity and invites us to imagine what we hope to see in the future. Also, Senait Brown is an anti-racist organizer who has served as the founder and co-chair of multiple organizations and collectives, including Ending the Prison Industrial Complex, or also known as EPIC, and the No New Youth Jail Campaign. And Asha Heru is an anti-racist organizer, educator, and artist born raised in Seattle, Washington. They're a founding member of the Black Power Epicenter and organizer and strategist with EPIC and the No New Youth Jail Campaign. Asha is committed to developing spaces for Black healing and liberation and strategies for Black wellness. All of you, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And I feel like it's worth acknowledging that the three of you are really busy right now, right? Senait, you have an 8-month-old. Asha, you flew to another part of the country just last night. So thank you for taking an hour with us today. We really appreciate it. And Senait, I want to start with you. I talked with King County Executive 2 weeks ago on KUOW. I interviewed him for the record, and he told me at that time that the county plans to close the newly built youth jail by 2025. However, as the three of you know, for years, you and other activists have been organizing and working towards first not building that new youth jail, and then secondly, ending youth incarceration in King County. So Senait, when you heard that announcement, we're gonna end youth detention here in King County in 5 years, what did you think?
Well, to be honest, I had a flashback to a meeting that we had in that same office. And I believe it was around 2013, 2014. And we were sitting in Dow Constantine's office mostly with a bunch of youth of color and YUIR, Youth Undoing Institutional Racism. And we were starting the meeting, and I remember one of the youth, Khalil, he said that he was like, we want to start this meeting off with introductions. We don't want to just jump into this because this is about some humanity. We don't want you to just listen to our ask, but really to internalize what we're saying when we say we don't need prisons anymore, especially for young people. And I remember Constantine saying, I'm not going to dance for you like a trained monkey. So if you think that's what's going to happen, then you can leave today.
Wow.
And that sticks out to me because it was so hostile. And also it was just so limited. The visioning was so limited. And it was such a threat to even have the audacity to think that we can live in a world without prisons. And it took the courage of really a lot of young people, a lot of young organizers. We're all older now, but to bring that to light. So as I listened to him say in 2025, that we can close down the prison, I'm like, we've already been there. It's a delayed response. It might be a political response, but the fact is we've already started to dismantle youth prisons in this state and in this country. So I'm more just affirmed about where we were already at.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, so you flash back to this moment where you have the King County executive saying, I'm not going to dance for you like a trained monkey, to now where there's this sort of narrative around this that, hey, look, we're doing it. It's happening. But there's still a 5-year timeline. So what are the goals that you have, looking forward to the stated timeline versus what actually needs to get done?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the timeline is just kind of, it's arbitrary. They can close the youth prison down today. There was never a reason to keep it going in the first place. And I think what we learned in our research was that they wanted to actually find money to build new courtrooms for judges. A lot of people don't recognize that the reason for the youth jail and them digging their heels in, there's just so much community, movement when the entire country is shutting down youth prisons. It's like, why in Seattle, of all places, would we be building? And they needed matching dollars for their federal funds in order to build new courtrooms. And I feel like now the courtrooms are built, and it's now easy to say, yeah, let's shut it down. My thing is it could be shut down tomorrow. I think that's what most folks are at. It does not need to be implemented over the last, let's not even talk about the next 5 years, over the last 8 years, there have already been alternatives to youth incarceration bill. There's a whole network of folks that are working towards zero use of detention. That entire phrase and concept was created by organizers, and you can look in that city resolution to see the history behind that and the intent behind it. So 2025, really the key is going to be implementation. And if Constantine or the King County government continues to use an analysis steeped in racism, they might be saying the right words right now, but the outcomes are not going to be different until they acknowledge that racism is the root cause behind why we're looking at young people being incarcerated. Your strategy is dependent upon your analysis of the problem. And so that's where I have more questions, and that's where it's going to need more oversight.
So let's move on here. I want to ask, because we mentioned abolition actually in the introduction. So I got a couple of questions here, but I want to start with this. Asha, if you can just explain exactly what is abolition, because I just want to make sure we define it for the folks that are out there that might not understand exactly what it means. So what is abolition, and what are the goals of abolitionist philosophy?
So let's start with the definition of abolition, right? That's the question. And so the Webster's dictionary version of the word abolition is the action or an act of abolishing a system, practice, or institution. And I think, I won't speak for all abolitionists, because we're not all working towards abolition of the same thing or all things, right? I think for me, what abolition has meant and still means is that we've all been steeped and brought up in a very specific way of knowing the world, right? And abolition is yes, tearing down of systems and institutions, but abolition for me has been more of an internal journey, I feel. It's like it's required me to take down all of the places where white supremacy has put little seeds in, right? And I think that it really is asking not only of myself but the world, how are we willing to do things different for the betterment of not only my body but my mind and my spirit, right? And I think abolition really is not asking but saying and declaring that we know a better way of living, right? We have access to better ways of living. This is not the history of humanity these last 500 years, right? But we've had other practices. And so I think the goal for abolition for me is to be able to choose, right? I think one of the things that makes capitalism so insidious is that it does take people's right to choose away, right? It takes people's agency and ability to speak for what they've known or what they've experienced. And so abolition for me is taking down systems that say that what we're experiencing isn't valid.
So Nikkita, you described yourself as an abolitionist as well. Do you think that like a 5-year goal of closing the new youth jail, does that fit within the scope of abolitionism?
I mean, I think that depends on just your definition of abolition. Of course, it fits within the scope, but is it an appropriate timeline given for how long we've been fighting this youth jail? No. In 2012, when the ballot initiative was first brought out to the public, to the voters, there was a group of people who spoke up and said that building a new youth jail is not only a waste of money, but more importantly, is inherently racist. And it is a significant investment in a white supremacist system that has purposely built a school to prison pipeline that puts our children in it and disproportionately puts Black children in it and Native children in it. And, so for 8 years, people have consistently said no new youth jail. And now we are in 2020, where the facility has 19 young people in cages, and they're telling us it'll take 5 years to fully transition out of that system. That's ridiculous, because what we're then doing is saying for 5 more years, we're going to continue to invest in a system of zero youth development, as opposed to actually finally making the cut and fully transitioning those dollars into zero youth detention and focusing on what do families who currently find themselves working to be liberated from that system and families who may find themselves in that system need. And there's an immense amount of resources that we spend, whether it's on prosecution, courts, the actual jail facility, probation, all the other things that go along with the criminal punishment system. There's also family courts in that building. And in this last year, we've seen a lot of uprising around family separation as it relates to immigration. Family separation is something that the United States has been doing for a long time, whether you're talking about removing Native children from their families and sending them to boarding schools, or the current criminal punishment system of removing children from their families and putting them in cages. That is something that's actively happening in that building. And so 2025 is too long of a timeline for a facility that's doing so much damage to our communities, especially when we know what we could be doing to heal and support those communities.
Thank you for that. So let me actually just follow up really quickly on that. One of the things that we hear, I've certainly heard that, and I'd love to kind of get your answer to it, which is they look at some of the youth that is in jail as like, well, they've been accused of serious crime. So what happens if we just kind of let them go, right? There's a kind of like this punishment mentality that I think is there. So I'd just love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, we know punishment doesn't work. The recidivism rate of the current criminal punishment system is something obscene, like 80%. So we already know that the punitive system is not creating better public health or better public safety. It's actually causing a cycle of violence. We know that once anyone has been in jail for more than 2 days, you've now done irreparable psychological and probably spiritual harm to them. We also know that when you take young people away from their families and the communities that care about them, you start to do irreparable harm around cultural development and health. And so to even insinuate that that system creates any amount of safety is to completely ignore the data. the second part is, and this is me speaking more as a lawyer and less as an abolitionist, is that the presumption in the state of Washington is release, that a person is innocent until proven guilty, and the presumption is that a person is released, and in the instance of a youth, goes before a judge. And what we've created is actually the reverse presumption, especially where the person being accused of a crime is Black or brown. We often find ourselves guilty until proving ourselves innocent. The people most likely to be held in a cage on an alleged crime are usually Black and brown folks. We are disproportionately affected by pre-court detainment, being detained prior to having a trial. And so, there's a lot of significant policy issues, but I think what's most important when we have this dialogue is acknowledging that the current criminal punishment system has failed us all on public health and public safety. Simply because a person is being held on an alleged violent crime, one is not a reason to put them in a cage, which is torturous. But also we know that it doesn't make our community safer or better. And that's really the impetus behind the No New Youth Jail coalition, is understanding, one, the system is white supremacist and it's enacting white supremacist policies upon our communities. And two, the criminal punishment system doesn't make us safer. And we actually want to be safe. We actually want to be healthy, rather than allowing continued investments in a very failed system.
Asha, I think you wanted to weigh in on that as well.
Yes, I definitely second everything Nikkita said. I was thinking, and it's not the first time folks have had that question or asked abolitionists, specifically prison abolitions, that question. What do you do with the murderers and the rapists? And what do you do with those folks, right? And I think it's an interesting question. I also think it's a very ahistorical question, right? Because we're not asking what do we do with the judges who have these backdoor shenanigans. We're not asking about the CEOs, the council members who are also perpetuating violence, right? We don't talk, when we ask that question, what do we do with the murderers and the rapists? We don't ask Amazon, what they're doing with the people that they don't give healthcare to, right? We don't ask that of those systems and institutions. So I think that's always an interesting dynamic. I also think that it's important to note that we're living in a country that was founded on violence, right? It was founded on violence, and then we treat individual acts of violence as this inhumane thing, right? And I think it's a question about, I think also too, those crimes make up a very, very small percentage of the people, of the crimes represented in the people who are incarcerated. And I think if we're not looking at that question from a historical standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint, then we're not really doing a good job about who has access to healthcare, who has access to resources in that way, as well as survival, right? A lot of, quote unquote, violent crimes are made out of survival, not necessarily out of necessity. And so what are the ways that systems and institutions keep people from thriving and surviving the best way they can, and perpetuating that harm? So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. So I want to ask just a quick question here before to kick it off to you, Jeannie, because we have some really great narrative questions that we want to talk about. But before that, since we are in a pandemic, organizing is usually difficult on just any normal day. And I'm just wondering, how has your work changed? How has COVID changed that? And any of you can kind of take that one.
It's a showdown. Who unmutes first?
Could you ask the question one more time?
Yeah, sure. I was just saying, organizing is difficult on any given day. So how has COVID-19 and just affected that? Did it change any of your tactics? Did you change any of your results? Are you seeing something different?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it and then pass it off to folks. Honestly, COVID is tragic, right? COVID is tragic, and COVID has also brought me so much peace. And I'm so thankful, not for COVID, that came out wrong. I'm thankful for the capacity that it's allowing for, right? And I think COVID has allowed me to be very specific about tightening up my circle and who I trust, right? Who I trust to take care of their health. in these organizing spaces, who I trust to like be in community, because, you know, we do a lot of virtual stuff, but we also do in-person stuff too. And I think something that I was talking to another organizer friend about was how organizing is really like very, very, you have to have a human component to it, right? And using all of this tech, it does, I would say it has been a strain. And it's also required me to develop safe relationships where I can be human. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Right. I would say, so I, became a new mom in the middle of this, or like right before it, or not really sure. And so I was thinking, I'm in a city where I'm from, my family's here, but I'm disconnected from my network. We do a lot of work through relationship, and relationship means we sit and struggle together. We sit in person. Nikkita knows, Asha knows, like hours and hours and hours, sometimes just strategizing or, thinking about our ideology and working on tactics. And so when you miss that component, I was even trying to think, well, what's my organizing going to look like as a mom, as someone who's, now spread out? And I was worried about being isolated. Now everyone's on Zoom. So I am like, I'm feeling the connection. But also, the reality is that COVID's pushed the survival button on a lot of folks, right? And questioned a lot of ways that we thought were ways of being. Here in Chicago, I remember saying, can I, do a job where I can just work remotely, or maybe part-time, or do consulting so that I can stay in integrity with my organizing. And I remember being looked at like I was absolutely insane. The culture here is not that you get to, do anything outside of a 9-to-5 job, that everything has to be employer-based. You have to be connected to the system. And so, now this new way of living has like moved some folks to, make jobs more accessible, but at the same time, it's only accessible for, very few. Most of the, working minimum wage or any sort of wage jobs here have been just cut. People have been thrown by the wayside. And it's kind of forced like an awakening, it's kind of like there's no sports, there's only so much Netflix you can watch. Like we're in high survival, and you start to look and be like, it's not just me. It may be, and we can stop, absorbing this message that it's just our individual actions that are, the explanation for our reality. There's actually something that's working quite well, around us, that we're all in this situation. And when it comes to, the really like, super survival moment for this whole planet, we can see those disparities even more. I think so many people have taken to the street or taken to looking at building alternatives. It's really broke us out of this box that we've had, and really been a reality check for a lot of folks, an opportunity for people who've been living in survival to think about, what we can, instead of constantly coming to the system or reforming the system to be able to serve us, made us actually think that, I don't think that's where our best energy is going, right? Asha said mutual aid work. I think that's definitely something we can see across the country that's happening. I'm seeing people build their own homeschool collectives because they realize what's going on in our education system. I've seen, of course, everyone's talking about the prison industrial complex and police and prisons, but so many more systems and how they're just been connected and colluding to create this reality for us have just been exposed. And whereas before I've seen, more of a, let's just fix it, tweak it a little bit, give our energy there. I'm seeing like a shift to, we cannot, invest ourselves in infrastructure that's inherently racist. We have to, plant seeds that's actually going to give us the capacity to live a different way. And we need to start that now. And we need to act like we need it tomorrow. So yeah, I think that's a huge shift.
Yeah. Zaki, can I ask a quick follow-up question about this?
Please.
Because I've heard this tension seems like a little too underwhelming a word for this, but the three of you have brought up the notion of the individual and individual action versus the notion of the system. And I think, Nikkita, as you were talking about, the focus is on singular criminals rather than, the Asha, you were talking about, we're not talking about judges. We're not talking about the gatekeepers of these systems and what they're enforcing and what they're upholding. I wonder, I'm going to ask you all a prediction question, which you can roll your eyes at me for. Do you think that this pandemic and the protests we've seen over racist police violence has brought us to a point where maybe we can just dispel the mythology of the individual being able to change everything?
You know, I actually think that that's a myth that was created by the system. I think it was a very intentional retelling of history and erasure of the fact that it's been community organizing and movements, especially of young people, of young adults that have transformed the way that we live time and time again. Whether you're talking about the ending of apartheid in South Africa, or you're talking about, you know, we love to talk about the 1960s in the United States and the civil rights era. And I say it like that because I think we're actually dealing now with the fallacies that many of us have been fed. You know, Asha talked about being ahistorical in the way that we talk about things.
Yes.
Many of us have been given whitewashed history, if not outright lies. And one of those lies is the lie of the figurehead. Ella Baker is someone I feel like I've learned a lot from, because she really pointed us toward understanding that strong, healthy people do not need strong leaders. Because you've built a community that is now self-empowered and self-determined. And I feel like part of our work to bring it back to No New Youth Jail, our goal has always been to build community power and to make sure that we don't give into revisionist history. And I actually feel like in many ways, and I'm just gonna call Dow out for it, Dow Constantine is participating in a revisionist history by making it sound like all of a sudden he had some revelation that now he wants to close the youth jail by 2025 because he realizes it's a public health and public safety issue. And the truth of the matter is there's a community movement from 2012 on, and many people even before that, many movements before that, that I as a young organizer get to stand on the shoulders of, that have actually laid the groundwork, the foundation for him to even put the letter that he put out and have it be received by people in King County, right? We did that political education work. We set the stage for that. And so I hope that we entirely get rid of the idea that an individual can change the system. No politician, no individual figurehead, no individual activist or organizer can change the system. And so we really have to be putting our energy into building the power of community, the political muscle of community. And this is where I think what's happened with COVID-19 and the current uprising is so significant, is the mutual aid solidarity networks we're seeing developed are actually bringing people closer to each other and understanding the value of our shared resources and combating racialized capitalism and combating white supremacy and combating patriarchy and sexism, understanding that when our community is unified around a vision, abolition is not just about destroying the bad systems, it is about a vision of the healthy system, that we actually develop, that we lay that groundwork in the community at the grassroots level, in the way that we build relationship and mutual aid networks with each other. We then teach the system how we want it to treat us.
Yeah, that's just to give you this, the individual thing. I mean, it's so baked into everything that we consume, right? Like you just look at all the superhero stuff and all of that stuff. It's always that one person that's going to go and do that.
All that Netflix we've been watching. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. All of that. And then of course you have somebody that said, you know, in power right now that says, I alone can fix it.
Yeah, but I just want to point out that's also part of white culture. It's like one of the ways that white supremacy is internalized, particularly by white people, and it's mimicked by folks of color, is that we all get to be individuals, right? You know, I do anti-racist training as well as everyone else, you know, across the country. And no matter what city I go to, there's always this question about, you know, I think we do a part in the training say, what do you like about being Black, Latino, Asian, white? And every single time, particularly for the white folks, it's like, well, I've never thought about it. I've never had to be collectivized. I've always gotten to be an individual. And that messaging is like to reinforce that. And it's also for us as folks of color who understand we are treated as a collective, is to kind of keep us on that hamster wheel where we think we're going to be, the head one in charge, or we're just going to pull ourselves up by our non-existent bootstraps. And somehow pull through. It's just to keep us in that mentality that is unaware of these larger systems, that individualism has never been real for us. We've never got to be an individual, and we're getting hyped up when we serve the system. When we get into a place of positional power, even our highest position in this country of president, when Obama was there, you can say, oh, well, look at him. He's so individually strong, but he didn't individually get to be Black or speak on issues that impacted his community. He had to be in service of that system. And as soon as he stepped out of line, which was way towards the end of the second term presidency to even say Black, that institutional hammer came down and let them know what their place is. And so just as an organizer, and I see us as somebody who sees us building our own right now, our own solidarity networks, as Nikkita was saying, I think we have to remember that we can never bend or absorb or mimic that individualism behavior. It wasn't set up for us. It doesn't serve us. It doesn't even serve white people, really, because it separates y'all from humanity. But for us, it just really is, it's a trick, and it keeps us off our game when it comes to maintaining our own infrastructure.
And can I just add, because Senait, I think, laid out a really good point. And I think Nikkita was alluding to like something similar, but we've always had like social systems that have allowed us to survive, right? There's no way in hell, excuse my language, that, us as people of color, specifically Black folks, would be able to live and survive in this country if we didn't have some type of social system, right? So we've always had it. Again, we've mimicked ways of individualism and other white supremacist culture, but I think we gotta remember that we've always had this knowledge. And that it's not just our knowledge, but our grandparents' knowledge and their grandparents' knowledge. Like, we've always had this.
We're talking with Senait Brown, Nikkita Oliver, and Asha Heru. They're all activists here in the Seattle area. We're talking about what organizing and activism looks like during a global pandemic. We're also talking about the No New Youth Jail movement. We're talking about the protests against racial violence that we've seen, particularly in the last couple of months around the country and here in Seattle. And we wanted to ask the three of you, we've talked about the idea of mythology and, false narratives and revisionist history. So I wanted to ask about how we see some of that stuff playing out, I guess, in real time, as we look at the coverage and information that's available, particularly around the protests that have happened here in Seattle in the last couple of months. We've seen a pattern. My phone just fell on the ground. That's what that noise was. We've seen in the last couple of months, the Seattle Police Department put out information that turns out to be false. And, in many cases, local media will publish that information. We'll find out later that it's inaccurate. Other times we see local media publish information just by saying, like, the Seattle police say, as though that's sort of enough for everybody to know that they only had one source. What do you think the disconnect is between the narrative that we're hearing from the police and the mayor's office and what's actually happening on the streets? Disconnect also feels like an underwhelming word here, but that's the one I've got, so.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't use disconnect. I call it propaganda. I genuinely think that the mayor's office and the chief know how mainstream media works, and in many ways make use of that. I don't know if y'all saw a video that was put out by a local independent journalist named Speck, but it was a video about a claim that the chief had made that then the media took, and then the chief spun it some more, and then the media took it further, and the mayor repeated it. And at each turn, when people tried to correct this piece of information, the chief said, well, I got it from the media, and the media said, well, I got it from the chief. And then it kept going back and forth. There is, people know how the media works. And I feel like, as someone who's been on the ground at protest, not just in this current uprising, but in multiple times when we've been in the streets, we've seen those in power who have access to the media machine take advantage of the lack of fact checking, take advantage of keywords like rioting or looting or violence, destruction, things that we also know are clickbait. And I use the word clickbait because I think the media takes advantage of clickbait. They want people to click on their articles. They want people to watch their network. And so they do things like use those words as well as a way of creating a spin so people will engage their media. And in this particular uprising, what I find so devastating and disturbing about it is it creates such a dangerous environment for protesters on the ground, many of whom in the streets, especially in this current uprising, are brand new protesters, brand new organizers, don't have the same level of experience that some of us do in terms of even just knowing what are some things you might want to bring to a protest. I remember early on in late May and in early June, when you would see people come to the protest in sweats and then leave having been gassed, maced, shot at with rubber bullets, and realize like, okay, I have absolutely nothing to protect me, and then come back with an umbrella, you know, right. Which makes sense. But at the same time, the what protesters have just for our protection is very different than what the police have in terms of enacting physical violence and mental violence through intimidation upon protesters. And then when you go read the mainstream media or statements from the police or the mayor, they're very intentionally spun to tell a different story. And so, you know, I'm personally incredibly thankful for folks like Converge with Omari Salisbury, who do put their bodies on the line and sit on the front line with their live streams going and attempt to create an access point where people can see what's happening for themselves and make up their own minds. That's part of what I think is missing from journalism right now, is just telling the facts. It seems like every news network wants a spin so that people will want to watch or read their things, and rarely ever are they just telling the facts and the observations so that the populace can use their critical thinking skills and then ask themselves what's right. Instead, I feel like there's a propaganda machine, and that, in my opinion, is not journalism by any means. That's propaganda.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about what that sort of news cycle, how that spin looks in this conversation around defunding the police, which is one of the demands that we've seen come out of these marches, out of these protests, out of this organization. You know, there is, obviously, to use this word again, a disconnect between what the mayor's office is saying about defunding the police and what organizers are saying about what defunding the police looks like. So I wanted to ask, you know, as you're talking about, you know, envisioning a new system, what does defunding the police look like? What does it look? What does a city look like where the police department has been defunded? This is a question for any of the three of you.
Okay, I just want to say like a lot. Well, it's kind of almost the same question. It's like you can interchange youth jail, right? Like it's got the same thing. Like, what does it mean when you say no prisons anymore, and how crazy is that? I mean, part of the role I think the media plays is also to disempower our community and to keep us like, you know, living in this fear that we have to have the systems that we have in place in order to survive and like move, and lifting those up as the only legitimate or evidence-based practices, you know, like those sort of efforts have to be, thank you, like fear mongering, those sort of, you know, examples of what success looks like. You know, there's only one narrative about that. And I remember just really struggling. I think to this day, we only have had one publication that ever really spoke to the conversations that are happening and the strategy that's happening within community when it comes to analyzing what it is that we are trying to do. When we say abolition or defunding or dismantling, it's really, again, I go back to that understanding of what the problem is. If we are looking at policing as its real history, right? You know, we all know it started from slave militia. We all know that it has protected property and supremacy and meant to be in control of Black and brown bodies for the economic benefit of others. You know, if we look at it from that standpoint and we understand that all systems, regardless of how many good-hearted people are in them, are working in collusion to create this reality for our community, then you start to think, well, what is my strategy going to be? What is my solution going to be? But if I'm still hanging on to the fact that, or hanging on to this idea that, you know, there's somehow some merit, I guess, in keeping something like policing the way it started and the way it is in this country in place, then my solution is going to be not to dismantle it, but to repackage it. You know, and that's what's happening. This language around racial equity, even people are saying anti-racism now, is really about repackaging racism and putting a prettier color on it, putting a prettier bow on it, making a new name, putting out a new report. And I'm like, you miss the part about how it continues to feed that power structure when we do so. And so that's why folks are investing in defunding. I'm just saying everything. I'm an abolitionist of every system. I think everything needs to be transitioned out because it's all rooted in the same thing. But we do have to be on the same page about where we are, how we are seeing the problem. Otherwise, we're just going to see all kinds of implementation. And I did work in city government, and I watched on both sides how things got lost in implementation. And I will tell you that you could write out 17 paragraphs about what this is, and you can have a person that's completely disconnected from that hired, who will take that initiative or that resolution. It's their job to implement it, have no community connection, have no analysis behind it, and just implement, I mean, just any type of thing. And I don't want to see that happen, which is why it's so important that we're investing in ourselves. So defunding to me, or abolition to me, has to start with a common analysis of what the problem is, and not reinvesting in the same systems we're trying to dismantle.
So this is a great segue to that, kind of like actually my next question, because social movements against police brutality and for the liberation of Black folks, this is not new, right? In 2020, Black Lives Matter movement expanded and gained large mainstream support, but it's been there for a while. But corporations, however, have scrambled to respond to nationwide, civil unrest, putting out statements in support of the movement or donating to organizations. They're kind of like tripping over each other to kind of show how aware they are, how woke they are when it comes to this. So I guess my question is, how do organizers navigate this issue, right? Where every corporation out there has a written statement supporting, these goals, but there doesn't appear to be any actual progress toward those goals. So yeah, that's my question, I guess. How do you navigate that?
Sorry, I have like 12 different thoughts just kind of jumping across my brain. And so I'm really excited by this.
That's awesome. Go for it. Number one.
Bring them.
Number one, right? I think this question is actually similar to Janine's, and it's like where it's asking us, and to the answers that have been giving, where it's asking us as organizers to make a decision about what the world looks like, right? It's asking us, a group of 3 organizers, to make decisions about what the world after capitalism looks like, right? And so I think about what Senait was saying about implementation, but also just the repackaging and the ways that policing exists outside of the prison industrial complex, right? So when we say abolition, we're also talking about abolition of corporations, right? We're talking about the abolition of nonprofits, right? Because in the world that at least we're collectively imagining towards, we don't need corporations or nonprofits, right? Which are literally antithesis, to each other. And yet we have them in this state, in this country, to confuse us about who the actual enemy is, right? Where it's like policing happens in nonprofits, policing happens in the education system, policing happens in the medical system, right? Like all of them are deeply ingrained. And so to like imagine what a world outside of that looks like is like, you have to experience it, you have to be actually living in it. And this is where my own propaganda starts to like, I get so excited because, I've seen it. I've been to places in the world where it's possible. But I think because of the way the media works, they're constantly convincing you that what you're asking for is impossible because you've never had it, when it's so possible. And so I'm sorry, I got really excited listening to Senait. And then even your question about corporations, because it's like, why are we buying, right? Why are we even buying? What are we buying that isn't already overutilized and also depleting the earth of its natural resources, right? There's literally nothing else that like has to be produced in order for people to have their needs met, if that makes sense. And so corporations are obsolete, nonprofits are obsolete, prisons are obsolete.
Yeah, I also, to add on to what Asha is saying, I think we have to remember that capitalism's number one goal is exploitation, and it is to keep growing as far as it can, eating as many resources as it can. I know that's not probably like the economic definition of capitalism, but in terms of how capitalism manifests, it's inherently exploitative. And so what's happening right now is people are breaking out of a bubble. COVID-19 meets Black Lives Matter uprising meets huge economic crisis. And when we think about like an only other time when something similar has happened in the last 100 years, give or take, is in the 1960s, when you saw the Vietnam War, you saw huge economic crises, and you saw tons of racial unrest. And it brought many people into the streets. And they first started, for some people, it was about the war. For some people, it was about getting Black folks equal rights. And for some people, it was about the labor movement and economic issues. And as these movements started to intersect with each other, people started to realize, oh crap, this is all about racialized capitalism and the exploitation of people and planet. And we're at a point again in history where I think significant numbers of people are being awakened to the problem of capitalism and the problem of racism, and the problem of patriarchy, and realizing those things are interrelated in creating a system that exploits people and planet. And so corporations aren't dumb. They're not dumb. They know how to market to us. So they're seeing where people are at, and they're like, oh snap, if we want to keep our base, we might want to throw a little social justice up in there. So, somebody got to pay Colin Kaepernick, make Nike look good. Somebody got to get the NFL on point to know what messages to have on the TV when people are watching the games. So they forget that white supremacy and racialized capitalism are in many ways trying to squash our ability to uprise. Asha was alluding to nonprofits. The rise of philanthropy was in response to the people rising up and saying, we're not going to continue to suffer. Our government has a responsibility to provide us with basic necessities. And so what happened? Corporations stepped in and said, we'll give a little money to the poor people, and maybe we can squelch this uprising that's happening, and we can get back to business as usual in this capitalist state. And so I really think they think that we're not smart enough to realize that they're just trying to get in on the wave. And I actually think, especially as we continue to see economic unrest and more mutual aid networks being built, more people are going to realize what Asha just said. Everything we need already exists in our communities, and we don't have to be at the behest of these corporations or even the government entities to have access to food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, and education. Those are things that when we build our mutual aid networks, we can actually provide those for ourselves. And we can start to push the power structure to have to shift, the economic structure to have to shift. And simultaneously, we're going to see the media buying into fear-mongering tactics. We're going to see corporations buying into that, because if they can keep you scared that in the new world you won't have what you need, maybe you'll just stay in the old one.
Wow. We're talking with activists and community organizers Nikkita Oliver, Senait Brown, and Asha Heru. And if you are watching live on YouTube or Facebook right now and have questions, we've got about 15 minutes left. We'd love to incorporate some of your questions. You can drop them in the comments below. You can also tweet us at KUOW Engage. You can also text the word radio to 206-926-9955. What did you say, Zeki?
It's actually, text the word active.
It is. I've been saying radio this whole time.
It's all right. That was
text the word active to 206-926-9955. Oh, no wonder we're not getting questions through that text number. So
I do have a couple of questions that came in, but there's a question I think you wanted to ask first. So go first, then I'll go ahead to the audience questions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we wanted to ask the three of you about is that we wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of self-care. We wanted to talk about, joy and laughter a little bit too. So, we were wondering what's bringing each of you joy right now. It's so much fun to watch your faces as you think about how you're answering these questions. Okay.
Come on.
It's the only thing I like about Zoom.
What's bringing me joy is all these colors, is that hat that I was wearing, everything. No, I mean, it's kind of funny because I think we all go through ebbs and flows as organizers. And I remember when self-care became like a buzzword, and I was like, what does that mean? I go to the spa, get my toes done. I know I'm looking rough. Like, is that what we're talking about? And it took me a while and I'm thankful to a lot of other folks for leading an example. To me now, what that means is that the work that you're doing, organizing or otherwise, it's not a compartment. This is not a separate job. It's not like work, home, organizing. This is our way of living, our new worldview. And if your new worldview doesn't include you in the plan and a plan for yourself, and you're not living in a space that's feeding you, that's, putting you in the place that you want to be, then you're going to ultimately get, burnt out or, not be able to sustain what we built. And I think that's like super critical, is that we've built things before, we have a history of that. But as oppression has sunk in to us, as we've been steeped in it, it's kind of manifested in a way that while we're doing our work, we can end up being harmful to ourselves, and then we're not able to sustain what we build. And I think that's the larger pattern of how we have what we're doing in the community when it comes to organizing and trying to build up a sense of power. Is we also have to figure out how to do that in a way that serves us. And so my son brings me life. I love Black Power and Pleasure Space, the Black Power Epicenter brings me life. Seeing the connectivity and being a conduit for Black liberation organizations to develop our own measurements of success and coordination, that brings me life. Tiny homes bring me life. And I'm working on a project that I'm not going to talk about yet, but it's a very, it's all in the design and tiny spaces. But doing some Black liberation work just brings me life.
Nikkita, Asha, what about you two?
I'm not even gonna front. I am burnt out. People always ask me, like, what do you do for self-care? And I used to try to come up with an answer, and to be quite frank, I kind of just laugh at people now.
That's fair.
Because, especially right now in the midst of COVID, like the pandemic is still real. I feel like all the things I had kind of built in my world to help myself stay stable, whether that's my boxing gym community or being able to catch happy hour with friends or go on walks with people, and just have conversations, lay out in the sun, like everything feels disrupted. And then you throw in what's happening with this current uprising in defense of Black lives. And I remember a moment when I went to a protest in the last couple of weeks, and we're getting flashbangs thrown at us by the police, and we're getting maced, and there's smoke in the air, and you're coughing. And I walked 3 blocks, and there were people having a glass of wine at a restaurant outside. And it was this moment of realizing my life feels like I'm in the middle of kind of a war. And there are other people having happy hour. And so I don't know how you rectify those two things, go from a flashbang to watching people not even realize what's happening 3 streets away from them. Sometimes self-care feels hard. Self-care can feel selfish. Like when I just need a day off to myself, I want to turn my phone off. I feel selfish about that because I also feel inherently very privileged, whether you're talking about as being somebody who has a license to practice law or being a light-skinned Black woman, or even just still having a job in the midst of a time when people don't, the feeling that me of all people, I need to be grinding nonstop. And so it's a real struggle or contention that I go through when it comes to figuring out what does self-care mean when there are some people in our city that are in the midst of what feels like a daily battle. And you can expand that to knowing that there are folks in our city that 14,000 people in our county that don't have homes, some of whom were experiencing getting swept by the Seattle Police Department in the midst of a pandemic. Self-care feels hard right now, and justifying it feels hard right now. And so I don't even really know how to answer that question if I'm transparent. I don't, the question I keep asking myself is, in 30 years from now, am I gonna still be doing the same stuff to try to work to get our people free? Or are we gonna be in a different place? And I'm sure when our elders did this in the 1970s and the 1960s and the 1940s and the 1900s, they could not imagine that in 2020, we'd still be fighting the same battle. And so that's kind of an exhausting thought, if I'm just transparent.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being transparent. I mean, an honest answer is really the best one there. And these are words a lot of people out there that really need to hear.
Yep.
Asha, what about you?
I do think it's a tough question. I like the way both of my my organizer buddies laid it out. I was thinking as Nikkita was talking about astrology, because why not? At the beginning of the year and parts of last year, we saw the nodes go into Capricorn and Cancer, and at the beginning of this year, there's a whole lot of planets in Capricorn. And something that the way I've been understanding things, at least sky energy stuff, is like there's a balance, right? There always has to be like a balancing energy to what's happening. And when I think about Capricorn, I think about literal structures, right? Like institutions, actual physical manifestations of systems and foundations. And I think all of the Capricorn energy, all of the Saturn energy, where we're being responsible and disciplined, has to be balanced out with something that can like cushion that, right? And that is Cancer energy, right? Where Capricorn is the house, Cancer is the home. And I think all of the things Nikkita laid out, the economic crisis, COVID, racism, all the other isms, all kind of converging, labor, is the fall of that structure. And the only thing that's going to patent that is the home. And I think for me, COVID has been about building homes. It's like, it's where I go, I need to know that I have a home somewhere. And that's how I found self-care. I think self-care is also akin to not only freedom, but safety, right? Like, where do you feel safe? And I think that's been what I've been moving towards. It's like, if it doesn't make me feel safe, I'm not there, right? And even in the midst of COVID, like finding ways to gather. I know it's risky, and you have to be really careful. You got to get tested every week. You got to, stay on your thing. And you also got to make sure that you're actually, I'm into the body, and like touch is necessary. Like, humans need each other. And so I find self-care in like small ways I can be safe with other people and home with other people. That's a great question. Also,
that's a great answer.
Yeah, we could keep you here for a whole long time because there's so much, but we only have like a couple of minutes left. So I think I just want to mention one thing before I kick it off to you, Jeannie, to kind of wrap this up a little bit. But I am getting some questions, and I think I think people are still having a hard time wrapping their head around exactly what life would look like with the deconstruction of these systems. And I know this is an idea that this is going to take a long time for people to really wrap their head around it. So I was just wondering if there are any resources we can kind of send people to, stuff they could read or something like that, to start to get, if they can get a little bit more involved in knowing what it would actually look like in practice.
Yeah, there's tons of resources. But one thing I want to say is, as we've been doing this defund work, we dug into the 911 calls, and 80% of them are like mental health or addiction supports needed type calls. And for me, what it looks like to defund the police or dismantle the police is about making sure people get responses that actually meet their need, that people get preventative care that keep them from ever touching the police or the criminal punishment system, that we get to a place where people actually have the things that help them be whole, healthy people. in our city, in our county, we have been so inhuman to think that 14,000 people without homes are going to get better with an armed police response when something goes down. I mean, if you don't have a home, what's actually going to help you live a healthier, wholer life? I feel like the answer is kind of easy. A home. You know, if you're struggling with mental health, what's going to help you get in a place? A stable home and mental health supports. Yeah. If you don't have employment to pay your bills, and as a result, you're having to commit crimes of poverty, what's going to help you? A home, maybe mental health supports, and a job. I mean, the answers are actually very clear in terms of what we do instead of an armed police response when things go down. We have to acknowledge that oftentimes police are called after an incident of harm has occurred. So they're rarely ever even intervening. And so I would actually really push people to just ask themselves, what keeps you whole and healthy? What keeps you whole and healthy? And that is actually what the answer is to what the world after police looks like, what the world after jails looks like. Is very simple. What keeps you whole and healthy? And if we as a society could wrap our minds around and our hearts around making sure people's needs are met, home, healthcare, education, food, clean water, support, culture, we would see a drastic change and even our belief that we need a punitive system, because people would be well cared for. And many of the things that we're afraid of, we would be less afraid of because we would also have relationship with our neighbors. So I would actually push people to get into your creativity. I'm an artist. Ask yourself, what do you need to be whole and healthy? And maybe draw it, maybe write it down. Maybe talk about it with your kids. Kids are wonderful people to talk about a world without police and prisons with, because they have not yet been locked into the idea that the only way to keep us safe is to have an armed response and to punish people. They actually view the world quite differently. So I would encourage people to talk to your kids. Talk with your kids. They might actually help you be able to see some things that you're not able to see because your adult brain is so socialized into punishment.
I love that idea that the resources we have available, we already have, because there are our own needs and the needs of people in our community and our kids. As Zeki said, we would keep you here for another hour at least, but we are at the end of this hour and we don't want to take up more of your time. So thank you, Senait Brown. Thank you, Nikkita Oliver. Thank you, Asha Heru, for talking with us and for being, so honest with the questions that we've asked you. We really, really appreciate it. Is there a place where folks can find each of you online? Do you want to share any social media handles or anything else? You don't have to.
I just want to share at Decriminalize Seattle and at King County Equity Now on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. These are coalitions. I think, go back to your question about individuals. I want to pump the coalitions. They're doing incredible work and they're full of organizers and organizers on the ground. They're a great place to go for resources.
Thank you for that. We'll have that linked in the comments below on our Facebook page, also on our YouTube channel, so folks can reference that later. Asha, was there anything, or Senait, was there anything that you wanted to suggest people follow?
Oh no, I was honestly, Nikkita hit it right on the head. I was thinking mutual aid, Seattle, also nurturing roots, to growing your own food, and so yes. Sorry, I forgot that. Yes. Follow everybody.
Perfect. Thank you. And like I said, we'll have all of those available. Thank you, all three of you. Thanks to everybody who joined us for this hour. If you have any questions that you think of afterwards, please drop them in the comments below. And we'll do our best to get you some answers. And if you want to keep up with news about this show, read our newsletter. You can sign up at kuow.org/engage. You can also follow us on Twitter at KUOW-engage.
And thank you for everybody who tuned in today. Stay tuned for some more awesome conversations on the next episode, which is on the 18th. We're going to explore what it means to be a health professional during a global health crisis. So that should be fantastic. And hey, if you like this show and you want to support us, you can subscribe to this channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Our producer is Zaytun Ahmed. Our events team is Charlotte Duran and Bridget Anderson. Our graphic designer is Tio Popescu, and our marketing manager, Michaela Giannotti. Our social media strategist is Juan Pablo Chiquiza. From all of us at KUOW, please be kind to each other and have a wonderful day.